Russia and China have been challenging the West for years. Their military buildups, infrastructure projects, and targeted economic support have bolstered their geopolitical clout. Critics say they're threatening the international order.
I'm really worried.
And now, as a deadly pandemic disrupts the world, the two powers are casting themselves as global saviors. They offer what everyone desperately needs: hope in little glass vials, COVID-19 vaccines.
We would be very happy to see these be rolled out.
Russia and China say they'll send their vaccines around the world. And this while the United States puts all its efforts into vaccinating its own citizens before looking outward.
The US is not a player in the game.
The European Union is also focusing inwards, scrambling to inoculate its own people. China and Russia are taking the opportunity to suggest they can rescue the rest of the world. Shouldn't we be happy with Russia and China stepping in to help save lives in Africa, Asia or South America? There is not much help inside from the US, and here in Brussels the European Union might have promised to share its vaccines with poorer nations, but right now it's preoccupied with trying to look after its own citizens. So shouldn't we be applauding China and Russia for their efforts? It was Moscow that won the global race to produce the first coronavirus vaccine, proven to give 92% protection against COVID-19. President Vladimir Putin proudly presented his country's Sputnik V serum after less than 8 months of development.
Насколько мне известно, сегодня утром впервые в мире зарегистрирована вакцина против новой коронавирусной инфекции.
Naming it after the world's first satellite launched by the Soviet Union explicitly evoked images of Russia as a superpower. The vaccine was a big win for the government domestically and internationally. It portrayed the regime as strong and capable to its own people, saying, "Look, we can deal with this crisis." And in offering the Russian vaccine to friends and allies abroad, the Kremlin saw a rare chance to improve its image. No longer a corrupt regime suppressing opposition politicians and putting down protests, rather a re-emerging power with groundbreaking scientists, global reach and a social conscience.
There's clearly an attempt to expand your political influence.
Dmitry Trenin is director of the Carnegie Center in Moscow. He says the global vaccine race is political and about big money.
It's big business, big pharma. There's only so much that you need to do to arm other nations, and there's a limit to how much they would spend on your aircraft or on your submarines. But if you have a threat that puts the existence of your significant portion of your population at risk, or at least their health, then there's nothing stopping you, and you will be buying those vaccines.
China quickly followed Russia with vaccines from two national manufacturers, Sinovac and Sinopharm, soon being rolled out at home and quickly making their way around the world. China was offering vaccines to poorer countries before clinical trials were even finished. For Beijing, vaccine diplomacy offers a way to make the world forget how little transparency it showed when the pandemic started. The government took a year to allow international experts into China to investigate the origins of the coronavirus. Now it's leading the fight back.
China's a two-edged sword. It can be very helpful, but it's very self-interested.
Lawrence Gostin, an expert on global health at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., suggests China will expect some kind of payback for its vaccine generosity, as it does for the huge investments in its so-called Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative.
The worst-case scenario is that it's bartering life-saving vaccines against something that will harm countries in the future. For example, to put countries into debt, as it's done with Belt and Road, extract resources or extract favors, or even extract geopolitical advantage. And you should never use a global health crisis for your own benefit.
The European Union promised to help the rest of the world with vaccines,
We will have more doses than we can use.
but has so far not delivered, sparking anger in some circles.
Be frank and say, my people first. Don't lie to me and say, we will be equal.
Professor Ines Bibangwawo is Rwanda's former health minister. She is willing to give China a chance where the EU has failed.
If China managed to give and save a big portion of Africans, you believe Africans will look at them negatively? You believe that when they keep their words with this, we are going to doubt their word when they will propose that? This is going to push for new agreements, for new partnerships.
As the pandemic continues to spread rapidly across the continent, most, if not all, immunization programs are using Russian and Chinese vaccines. Egypt ordered vaccines from China, for example, and Guinea is rolling out Russia's Sputnik V vaccine. And it's not just Africa. Russian and Chinese vaccines are going global. Chinese drug makers have signed deals to supply their vaccines to Malaysia, Brazil, the Philippines, and many others. Countries that have ordered Russia's Sputnik V vaccine include Argentina, Mexico, and Belarus. The contracts are signed and sealed. But will Russia and China deliver? Will they ship supplies to other countries when they haven't yet inoculated their own people? And frightening new variants are emerging.
China continued the phrase challenges in practicing that so-called vaccine diplomacy.
Yang Zhanghuang is a senior fellow at the US-based Council for Foreign Affairs and an expert on China's healthcare system.
I think one of the biggest challenges now is how to balance this need for domestic vaccination needs, right, and the needs for practicing vaccine diplomacy abroad, right. Now we have seen the developments that suggested that the Chinese vaccine makers are delaying the shipment of the China-made vaccines, right. We saw that is happening in Brazil and in Turkey.
The EU has failed so badly on supplying vaccines to others that even some of its closest neighbors, Serbia for example, are pinning their hopes on Russia and China. They are desperate to protect their citizens and tired of waiting for the European Union to act. The EU planned from the start to help developing nations. It invested heavily in research and development. The bloc sealed deals with 6 different drug makers to secure more than 2 billion doses of eventual vaccines. It said that wasn't just for its own population of 450 million, it was to help others too. But those fine sentiments seem to have been postponed. As production problems slow supply within the EU, there does seem to be a retreat to putting Europe first.
We're seeing a lot of hypocrisy, we're seeing a lot of promises and very little action.
Russ Kors works for Doctors Without Borders. She's outraged by what she calls the West vaccine nationalism, which has meant the West isn't exporting the vaccines it's developed.
We've seen a lot of nice words from the European Union and other rich countries as well, that these vaccines should be considered global public goods and that they should be accessible to all, particularly given the high amounts of public funding that has gone into the development of them. But what we're seeing is vastly unequal distribution of these vaccines around the world. The reality is that for actually the majority of low and middle income countries, they might not get access to a vaccine for potentially years.
Even some members of the EU itself seems to be losing faith and looking elsewhere. Hungary has become the first EU country to approve a Chinese vaccine, a huge credibility boost for Beijing. And now even EU heavyweights like Germany seem open to the idea of buying Chinese or Russian vaccines once they are approved. And the United States?
These trends demonstrate that our aggressive strategy to battle the virus is working.
The US was one of the countries hardest hit by the pandemic. And the Trump administration pinned their hopes on Operation Warp Speed, pumping more than $10 billion into a huge vaccine development program. And that proved a success, and several vaccines are now available. But they're first and foremost for Americans. Trump's successor, President Joe Biden, promised that America would take the lead in the global COVID-19 response and took the US back into the World Health Organization on his very first day in office. But the focus is still on Americans, and the damage to America's standing is already done. With the US absent as a global player and the European Union looking inward, it is no surprise that Russia and China have rushed in to fill the void. The global vaccine race is part of an international power game, and the West is in danger of losing more ground or simply being relegated to the sidelines. As more vaccines are approved and produced, experts predict rich countries could return to normality by the second half of 2021. But many low-income countries may have to wait for years before they can achieve the same.
This is just, it's unacceptable. We're all in this together, and if there was ever a time for us to work together as a common humanity, this is the time, but we're not doing it.
We're starting to see mutations and variants of coronavirus developing around the world. If you leave it to the coronavirus to spread, we may see more mutations that potentially, could put at risk the efficacy of vaccines that we've already had administered in rich countries, and may, mean that they don't work. So actually, it's a moral obligation, but it's also a sensible one if we're actually going to effectively tackle the pandemic.
Europe and the United States have a choice to make. Do they want to put their own first and leave the international fight against COVID-19 to Russia and China? That would risk deep damage to their images around the world. It would leave the door open to Russia and China creating lasting new friendships and dependencies in possibly strategically important countries. It might also increase the risk of the pandemic continuing at a lower level or regionally. Or do they want to try to make up the lost ground and help other countries, even if that means telling some of their own people that for the greater good, those coveted vaccines must be shared? The time to make that choice is now.